Balthazar's beard. Ring burns.
Those damn savages killed them all.
I will never allow Ascalons to live in the shadow of the Krytans.
The Ascalonians are a people of humanity which hail from the eastern portion of civilized Tyria, or at least the portion of the continent Tyria open to us in the games Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars 2. They are often described as the grim people of the East by their Orian and Krytan brethren, likely owing to their lives of near-constant conflict. As practitioners of magic, the Ascalonian people take a much more conservative approach compared to the people of Or, preferring to trust in stout stone fortification and hardy steel. This isn't to say that they're not apt practitioners. Ascalon is what they call their home. The country, province, and even its last major city after the cataclysmic searing. Ascalon is the spirit of the people. It's a rallying call that transcends time and persists for over 1,400 years. The name Ascalon can be traced all the way back to 100 years BE, which stands for before Exodus, referring to the time the pantheon of human-worshipped gods left Tyria in the physical sense. When humans first arrived in Tyria, they settled first the kingdoms of Or and Korna. A group of voyagers sent by King Doric himself settled the first habitation in the virgin eastern hinterlands in the year 100 BE. This frontier would later be known as Ascalon. They didn't find this territory uninhabited, however. Living in this land was its masters and its historical conquerors, the Charr. The Charr had fought ferociously against the Forgotten to claim this land centuries ago, and they considered it the seat of their people. They were understandably loath to surrender. However, at this point, the Charr were little more than a numerous but disorganized group of disagreeing warbands, a direct consequence of the assassination of the Charr leader, the Khan Ur, which shattered the Charr unification. The Charr were eventually driven from Ascalon, far into the north, into uncharted wilds. In fact, the fledgling Ascalonians settled as far north as Grothmar Valley, where their architecture can still be found. With the Charr driven from their land, the Ascalonians enjoyed a long period of relative peace. A generation of people would have the opportunity to build Ascalon up into a metropolis of trade, culture, and military readiness. In the year 1 BE, the sixth god Abaddon gifted the sentient races of Tyria with the ability to practice magic. As nice as that sounds, throughout the world this ill-gotten gift resulted in terribly bloody guild wars, which would rage for a staggering 1,070 years. Ascalon would take part in all three of these wars, pitting them against their brethren in Kryta again and again. The outcome and timing of the first guild war is unknown, but the second guild war appears to have ended in a victory for the stalwart Ascalonians, evidenced by a monument outside of the ruins of Sirmia. During the Second Guild War, in the year 898, the Ascalonians finished construction on the Great Northern Wall. This mighty fortification stretched from the foot of the Shiver Peaks to the west to the foot of the Blaze Ridge Mountains in the east. Any assailants, be they human or otherwise, would have to overcome this obstacle or be funneled through small, highly defensible choke points. The hope was to make their conquering of the land permanent and keep the Charr at bay forever. Unfortunately, this was too good to be true. The third and final guild war would be ended quite abruptly by a terrible cataclysm. Though the Charr were mired in orthodox inner conflict and stymied by human magics, they would eventually come to understand that the humans' aid from the pantheon of gods they worshipped could be emulated within their own society. In 1070 AE, the Charr renewed their offensive. They struck southward at cities outside the protection of the Great Wall. Villages such as Greenwich and Piken, the Academy at Nalani, and the Fort at Sirmia, as well as the capital city of Draskir, would all come under siege outside the embrace of the wall. The Ascalonians had unfortunately discarded the Charr as a true threat, having been focused on their human enemies, and they lost control of their capital. The reigning monarch of the time, King Adalbern, was forced to relocate the capital to Rin, a city far south and west, and well behind the wall. However, just as it reached a fever pitch, the Charr assault didn't just abate, it seemed like it nearly vanished. This led the overconfident Adalbern to assume the Charr had no strength left. He issued a proclamation for heroes to rise up for Ascalon and drive the Charr back north again. But the Charr had found patrons of their own. Borrowing power from destitute beings known as Titans, the Charr were gifted an artifact known as the Cauldron of Cataclysm. It was this potent magical artifact that allowed the Charr to call forth an event known as the Searing. This invocation brought a rain of destructive meteoric crystals, which scoured Ascalon from the foothills of the Shiver Peaks all the way to the furthest reaches of the Regent Valley. And with this, Ascalon City, Rin, and Sirmia, as well as many other minor outposts, were completely devastated. Untold thousands lost their lives, and morale was likewise maimed. But the most damning blow of all was to the monumental aegis that had shielded Ascalon for centuries, the Great Northern Wall. Having now punctured this bulwark at numerous points, the Charr poured in immediately, taking advantage of the stunned Ascalonians. Over the next 2 years, the Charr would baptize their victory in Ascalonian blood. Their triumph was forged in Lend-Lease magic, but it was tempered in conventional combat, in fang, claw, and steel. The nation of Ascalon was hemorrhaging, but the only thing coming over the mountains to the west was silence. In 1072 AE, the events of Guild Wars I begin. The Ascalonians are exhausted and faltering by the day, but you wouldn't know it if you listened to King Adalbern. The dauntless monarch continued to declare to his people that Ascalon would rebuff the Charr just as they had a millennium ago. But his son, Prince Rurik, saw the salient truth for what it was, and openly defied his father with an expedition to the Great Northern Wall. There, he saw the Charr host laying before him, and his fears were cemented, and his plans to leave Ascalon behind became a priority. Rurik recovered an artifact, the mouthpiece to a great horn that can summon rain, Stormcaller. Rurik confronted his father outside the ruined capital of Rin with this artifact.
It would be wise to escape while we can. We should make for Kryta and rebuild our strength, not wait here for death.
You are no longer my prince, and you are no longer my son!
With his father's madness worsening, Prince Rurik leads any Ascalonians who will follow him out of Ascalon and westward to hopeful shelter among their former rivals, the Krytans. The journey over the malevolent Shiver Peaks was not without difficulty, and in fact, it was tragic. Facing resistance from the xenophobic Stone Summit dwarves and the natural fauna of the mountains, the Ascalonian refugees were barely able to make passage, and at the cost of Prince Rurik's life.
You cannot save me. Get them to Kryta. Hurry, go!
Your punishment for trespassing is death.
The refugees of Ascalon made it to Kryta, but having lost their beloved prince, it felt more like a Pyrrhic victory. With the cold Shiver Peaks behind them and the verdant fields of northern Kryta ahead, the Ascalonians could only wonder what sort of reception they could expect from their formal rivals in the centuries-long guild wars. And this reception may have been as frosty as the foothills behind, except the Ascalonians, led by Rurik's trusted heroes, aided the Krytans with an undead problem, earning the trust of the ruling faction, the White Mantle. But we won't go down that rabbit hole for now. The Ascalonian refugees were granted asylum in northern Kryta, where they constructed the Ascalonian settlement, and there they largely prospered on the south shore of the Giant's Basin Salt Lake. Here they would come to assist in the construction of Divinity's Reach on the old Watchtower coast, and set up an entire quarter in the great city, naming it Rurikton, after the slain prince who gave his life that they might live theirs. But that wasn't to happen for a couple of centuries at least. Though many left with Rurik on his exodus, many, if not most, Ascalonians remained loyal to their king, and chose to remain behind to defend their ancestral home. Little remained to be protected, however. The king had the surviving Ascalonian forces consolidate in the final stronghold left in Ascalon, the former trade hub and now capital, Ascalon City. Meanwhile, the king dispatches his very best to the north, in the hopes that they might disrupt the Charr from within their own territory. The Ebon Vanguard is an elite force whose initial purpose was the service of the heir apparent, Prince Rurik, under the name the Ascalon Vanguard. With the departure of the prince, those who remained were tasked by King Adalbern to strike out north and west, digging in deep, disrupting supply lines, freeing prisoners, and killing Charr, diverting attention from Ascalon. One such prisoner was named Gwen.
I do not forgive you, but most of all, I do not fear you.
A young girl during her incarceration, Gwen escaped the Charr twice under her own devices and joined the Vanguard. I won't go too deep into the legend of Gwen the Goremonger in this video.
I'm doing my job, killing Charr.
That story is magnificent enough to warrant a video of its own. I will mention this. The Ebon Vanguard, under Gwen and Captain Langmar, were also responsible for the release of the Charr from centuries of religious dogma, with the help of Pyre Fierceshot, a Charr legend. The Ebon Vanguard were very successful in their endeavors, so naturally, Adalbern being Adalbern, he recalled them. He hailed them as heroes and ordered them next to see to the fortification of a junction between the Crystal Desert and the Blaze Ridge Mountains. Over the coming season, their military victories against the Charr in that region combined with the rich deposits of stone and metals from the Blaze Ridge Mountains behind them, enabled the Vanguard to extend walls west and north, as well as providing for the construction of the mighty Hawk Gates, an architectural marvel unmatched to this day in its scale and application. Although this would take place over years, and would see the fall of Ascalon City in the meantime, and the effective defeat of the nation of Ascalon proper. The inhabitants of Ebonhawk existed as a quiescent belligerent to the Charr, easily contained in their stronghold by an Iron Legion detachment, and so it would remain for 230 years, until the time of Guild Wars II. While the Ebon Vanguard were putting down roots in the east, the king leads his forces directly in Ascalon City until 1090 AE. Herein, the final battle of Ascalon City takes place. The Charr are successful in sacking the city, and the Ascalonian forces beg their king to retreat with them to Ebonhawk to fight the Charr another day. But madness has taken full control of Adelburn, and he declares, "We will never surrender. Never." Using his magical sword, Magdair, the king summons forth a final gambit, unleashing a horrendous cataclysm of his own, known as the Foefire. In an instant, blistering heat washed down the hills from the city center, annihilating the Charr invaders and human defenders alike. But as the smoking Charr corpses remained, the souls of the human Ascalonians rose again, bound in eternal service by their king to defend Ascalon until the end of time, or until the honored king of Ascalon returns with either of the twin swords, Magdair or Suhathan, to break the curse. Just like that, the surviving Ascalonians in Ebonhawk and the refugees in Kryta were orphaned by their monarch. The nation of Ascalon proper was no more. Their history, their culture, their architecture, and their people would not only persist, but they would cry havoc on the pages of Tyrian history for the known and unknown future.